You know, after yesterday and thinking about things overnight and this morning and hearing some of these talks, I really think that the only answer, the only solution to this is to rescind the mandate. I don't think there's a compromise here. I think just rescind the whole mandate. Let's get back to where we were, because the problem we have is that, again, religious freedom started here. We were taken to an extreme level, and now we're talking about giving back some portion. That means I lost this much religious freedom. So I think we got to go back and just rescind the mandate and start with where we began. The other thing I want to make sure you knew is that these talks will be available. They're actually being recorded and filmed, as you may notice, and so we'll find out how to get the information to you, but if you're interested in getting copies of it, there'll be availability to get the copies. I would like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Nancy B. Matthews. She was born and raised in Bridgeport, Connecticut. She graduated from Smith College, where she majored in government, and is an honors graduate of the University of Connecticut School of Law. Mrs. Matthews recently stepped down as Chancellor of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Bridgeport, and make sure I get this right, an office she held for over 8 years. As Chancellor, Mrs. Matthews was Chief of Administration Office for the diocese, as well as its Chief Legal Officer. Prior to serving as Chancellor, Mrs. Matthews practiced law and also served as Deputy Treasurer of the state of Connecticut. For her work as Chancellor, Bishop Laurie presented Mrs. Matthews with the Pro Ecclesia et Pontificis for the Church and Pope Medal from Pope Benedict XVI. The medal, also known as the Cross of Honor, was established by Pope Leo XIII on July 17, 1888, and it is given for distinguished service to the Church by lay people. Mrs. Matthews is now working for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, an ad hoc committee on religious liberty, which is chaired by Bishop Laurie. Her talk this evening, and unless she's changed it also, is why the committee, why now, and its goals and objectives. So will you please join me in a warm welcome of Mrs. Nancy Matthews.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here and to speak to you today about the Ad Hoc Committee for Religious Liberty, chaired by Bishop Laurie. When Bob first asked me to talk about why the bishops felt the need for such a committee, of course the HHS mandate had not been quite as public, although it had been pending for a while. But today what I will do is talk to you about why the bishops felt the need to establish the Ad Hoc Committee, what they were reacting to, and what the Ad Hoc Committee for Religious Liberty hopes to accomplish. Certainly the HHS decision, even in the face of the thousands of comments in opposition to what they called the interim final rule, and I agree with Kyle, only the government can call something an interim final, is a public affirmation of the need for the committee. However, well before the HHS mandate, religious liberty in our country, the United States, has been under egregious assault for many years. In announcing the establishment of the Ad Hoc Committee for Religious Liberty in September of 2011, Archbishop Dolan spoke of the palpable sense of unity and commitment among the bishops at the June Bishops' Conference meeting regarding the urgent need to safeguard religious liberty inherent in the dignity of the human person. Archbishop Dolan referenced in particular an increasing number of federal government programs and policies that would infringe upon the right of conscience of people of faith or otherwise harm the foundational principle of our country. From June, from the date of the June meeting until the September announcement of the committee, the new threats included the HHS mandate. At the time it was still interim final, although it actually was final. The HHS requirement that the USCCB Migration Relief Services provide the full range of reproductive services to trafficking victims and unaccompanied minors in its cooperative agreements and government contracts. That had just been instituted and they were denied a renewal of those contracts. Catholic Relief Services concerned that USAID under the Department of State was increasingly requiring comprehensive HIV prevention activities, including condom distribution, as well as a full integration of reproductive health activities within a range of international relief and development programs. and the decision by the U.S. Justice Department to not only drop its Defense of Marriage Act, but to actively characterize the supporters of marriage between a man and woman as motivated by bias and prejudice. And then, of course, the U.S. Justice Department's unprecedented and radical position that the religion clause of the First Amendment does not contain what's known as a ministerial exception, which basically says that religious groups have the right to choose their ministers without government interference. And of course, Kyle spoke of that earlier. And the New York legislature had passed, and the governor signed a law redefining marriage with only a very narrow religious exemption. Already, county clerks were facing legal action for refusing to participate in same-sex unions, and gay rights advocates were publicly emphasizing how little religious freedom protection people and groups will enjoy under the new law. These were just some of the more recent threats to religious liberty since the bishops had met in June. However, across the country, dioceses had been finding themselves in battles for a basic fundamental principle of our country that most of us, until recently, had taken for granted. Hence the palpable sense of unity and commitment among the bishops to make religious liberty a priority of the USCCB. Bishop Laurie, Bishop of the Diocese of Bridgeport, Connecticut, which encompasses Fairfield County, Connecticut, was appointed chair of the Ad Hoc Committee for Religious Liberty. He laid out the challenges to religious liberty when he discussed the reason and purpose of the committee in his address to the bishops' conference in November 2011. He quoted Gregory the Great, who said, "Note that a man whom the Lord sends forth as a preacher is called a watchman. A watchman always stands on a height so that he can see from afar what is coming. Anyone appointed to be a watchman for the people must stand on a height for all his life to help them by his foresight." Citing the Second Vatican Council's admonition to read the signs of the times, Bishop Laurie looked through the two lenses of the binoculars. One which sees the teaching of the Church on human dignity and religious liberty, and the other lens which sees the heritage of religious liberty bequeathed to us by our founding fathers. And how do the two lenses work together? The lens of our church teaching proclaims, quote, "The ultimate source of human rights is not found in the mere will of human beings, but in man himself and in God the Creator." And in Dignitatis Humanae, the Church is absolutely clear about religious liberty. The human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups or of any human power, in such ways that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in associations with others, within due limits. This right of the human person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law whereby society is governed, and thus is to become a civil right. This right is fundamental because, quote, "The exercise of religion, of its very nature, consists before all else in those internal, voluntary, and free acts whereby man sets the course of his life directly toward God, and thus no one should be forced to act in a manner contrary to his conscience." Pope Benedict XVI recently, in his 2011 address to the diplomatic corps, said, quote, "Religious liberty is the first of human rights, not only because it was the first to be recognized, but also because it touches the constitutive dimension of man, his relationship with his Creator." Through the lens of our American heritage, we read the Declaration of Independence that recognizes certain inherent human rights, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and the Constitution, which more fully articulates those inherent rights in the Bill of Rights, wherein freedom of religion occupies pride of place. It is first in what Henry Abraham, a noted constitutional scholar, called the honor roll of superior rights. Or as John F. Kennedy said in his inaugural address, "The rights for which our forebears fought come not from the generosity of the state, but rather from the hand of God." Professor Mary Ann Glendon, the learned Hand Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and former ambassador to the Holy See, points out that religious freedom is the source of all other human rights and a kind of litmus test or touchstone for the protection of human dignity. The importance of religious liberty for individuals and religious institutions was recognized early on as essential for our country's great experiment in ordered liberty. George Washington saw the importance of morality and religion for political prosperity. De Tocqueville saw clearly that religion and religious freedom are indispensable support for our country's great experiment in ordered liberty. The importance of religion in bringing to the public square the imperative that civil laws be just was articulated by Reverend Martin Luther King in his famous letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963, when he said, "I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a law that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law." Who but individuals of faith and religious organizations will bring to the public square the imperative that our civil laws be just laws rooted in eternal law and natural law? Who will, to quote Reverend Martin Luther King, be the conscience of the state? It, church, must be the guide and critic of the state and never its tool. Thus, as Bishop Laurie said, we seek protection by law and acceptance in our culture of intermediate institutions, the family, churches, and schools that stand between the power of the government and the conscience of individuals, all the while contributing immensely to the common good. As Bishop Laurie said to his brother bishops in November, we look to government to protect religious liberty, to promote tolerance among various religious faiths and those with no faith. It is for government not to allow religious liberty to be compromised by other claims and interests, not to become, as Professor Glendon has warned, a second-class right. The right to religious liberty and the free exercise thereof does not mean simply the right to go to church and worship privately. Free exercise of religion embraces the freedom to bring those values into the public square, to run faith-based works of healthcare, education, charities, and social services consistent with the tenets of one's faith. The free exercise means the right to live one's life, shaped by one's religious beliefs. When the right to religious liberty for both individuals and institutions is compromised, and the public square is devoid of the value of faith and reason, it will be replaced by a godless secularism, which will put our great American experiment of freedom at the mercy of state actors. We do not seek a sacred public square, but an American one. In looking through the watchman's binoculars, what did the bishop see? You see a church, the largest non-governmental provider of social services, who serves the common good with extraordinary generosity and effectiveness. However, at the federal level and in many states, the ability of the church to deliver its services in a manner that respects the faith that impels us to provide them, as Bishop said, is being challenged. The HHS mandate is a perfect example of a sweeping government intrusion into the right of individuals and religious institutions to practice and to live our faith. Bishop Laurie looked through the binoculars and he saw a pattern in culture and law to treat religion merely as a private matter between the individual and his God, to treat religion not as a force for the common good, but as divisive and disruptive and better kept out of public discourse. However, if we are not free to bring our religious values into the public square, to run our faith-based institutions consistent with our beliefs, and live our lives consistent with those religious beliefs, then we are not free. Or, as Bishop Laurie put it quite succinctly, there is no freedom of speech if one is free to say what he or she believes only privately, but not publicly through the media, the arts, libraries, and schools. Bishop Laurie looked out and saw that all too often the phrase separation of church and state is used to exclude the church from public policy. This development ignores the history of churches in challenging child labor laws, in the abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, and promoting just labor practices. A good friend of mine recently observed that Reverend Martin Luther King is increasingly referred to as Dr. Martin Luther King. But he was a reverend and quoted extensively from old scriptures as he fought for the dream of racial equality. Religious faith was an integral driving force of the civil rights movement. The Establishment Clause has been expanded to narrow the protections of the Free Exercise Clause. In the mantra of some interest groups, the separation of church and state, historically understood to forbid the state from impeding the free exercise of religion, has now been turned on its head so that the state has become hostile to religion. Religious beliefs and values in the public square are in danger of being replaced with what Pope Benedict XVI has called a, quote, radical secularism, which is itself a system of beliefs. Or as Bishop Laurie said, quote, in failing to accommodate people of faith in religious institutions, both law and culture are indeed establishing unreligion as the religion of the land and granting to it, the unreligion, the rights and protections that our founding fathers envisioned for citizens who are believers and their churches and church institutions. In his November address to the bishops, Bishop Laurie cited the more dramatic threats to religious liberty over the years, including, of course, the looming HHS mandate, the criminalization of Good Samaritan services, which religious organizations provide to the undocumented, the county clerk in New York who faces legal action because she refuses to take part in same-sex marriages, or the 2009 attempt by some members of the Judiciary Committee of the state legislature in Connecticut to reorganize parishes in a manner utterly opposed to Catholic teaching and law. How many of you here know about what happened in Connecticut? Anyone familiar with that? Bob is. Let me share with you what happened in Connecticut in 2009. I was chancellor at the time and very involved in it. Bishop Laurie mentioned it in his speech in November, and it was a very egregious assault. The bill, which we now is now infamously referred to as Bill 1098, was raised by the two co-chairs of the Judiciary Committee of the Connecticut State Legislature. The two co-chairs were both attorneys. They were gay men who had a great hostility towards the Catholic Church in which they were raised. And I can speak firsthand, can give firsthand account of their hostility because I had testified before that committee on occasion. They were upset with the church because of the church's position on the sanctity of life and on the sanctity of marriage as between a man and a woman. They were approached by dissident Catholics, one an attorney and one a professor of religious studies, who wanted to reorganize Catholic parishes to be run by a board of trustees, separate and apart from the pastor and the bishop. Ironically, what they proposed looked very much like the structure of a congregational church, and that had been the state religion in Connecticut until the mid-1800s. So, in Connecticut, just so you know, the parishes, the different churches, particularly the hierarchical ones, the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Church, Methodist, Lutheran, all have, their parishes each have separate corporate enabling statutes, basically just which allows the different parishes, and in fact there's a corporate enabling statutes for dioceses, to hold property and conduct business in corporate form so that all the parishioners don't get individually sued. But they're only enabling statutes. Well, in January of 2009, the Judiciary Committee raised hundreds of bills on a consent calendar, and a bill targeted only at Roman Catholic parishes, just that statute, was raised under the rather innocuous title of corporate form. In March, on a Wednesday afternoon, the Connecticut Catholic Conference was told that the next morning, this bill to reorganize Roman Catholic parishes, contrary, of course, to church law and teaching, was going to be raised and put down for a hearing the following Wednesday. Well, by Friday, all 3 Catholic bishops in Connecticut had sent a letter to be read at all masses over the weekend. And on the back of the letter was the contact information for the members of the Judiciary Committee. I'll tell you about what we did in Bridgeport because I was part of that. Bishop Lurie had gathered all the College of Consultors and all the priests, Catholic school principals, directors of religious education, and Catholic Center employees to discuss Bill 1098. What's the bill about? What's the problem with this bill? What is our church teaching? And to get their help in organizing the various Catholic networks. Catholic school parents and teachers, parishioners, Knights of Columbus, the Knights and Dames of Malta. I should tell you that the area directors, my neighbors in Connecticut, were extraordinarily helpful in the fight. The senior staff organized to handle communications with the media, including TV and radio, and organizing efforts for a rally for religious freedom scheduled for the day of the hearing. By Monday, the email and phone system of the state capitol offices had collapsed from the onslaught by angry Catholics and other citizens appalled by the actions of the Judiciary Committee. You know, to be fair, we found out after the fact that only a very few members of the Judiciary Committee even knew what this bill was about. But they found out very quickly over the weekend. They were besieged. So the bill was withdrawn on the eve of the hearing, but the rally was held. Over 5,000 people. Catholics and other people of goodwill showed up. They were appalled. I tell you about this because it's important for a few things. One, in that effort, education was extremely important. The local newspapers initially carried the story as one about financial reform. Now, this made no sense. There had been a defalcation at one of the parishes, but that had been investigated by the diocese, turned over to the civil authorities. There was no good reason. It was just a very poor excuse. Fortunately, however, in communicating with so many networks of Catholics over the weekend, and when this came out, we were able to get out the facts of what this bill was about and what the problem was with it. The fact that it was frankly, it was unconstitutional on its face. I mean, there's a doctrine of church autonomy, and this was clearly the government coming in to reorganize the church, contrary to its teaching. The press did not cover the religious liberty arguments against Bill 1098 over the weekend. By Monday, when the storm of angry Catholics and other citizens had made their views known, they kind of got shamed into it. The other good thing was that noted constitutional scholars and very fine Catholics stepped up to speak publicly. And with outreach, we were joined by other Christian groups. The diocese put on its website the video of the bishop talking to everyone about it, and it went, in the words of my daughters, it went viral, went all over. So you all may not have seen it, but a lot of young people did. So the point is that the Catholic diocese effectively used their networks to talk over the head of the media until they had no choice, but they had to report it a little bit more fully. I will tell you that the initial reaction of the State Attorney General, who was pretty astonishing to us, because his first reaction was, well, these church corporation statutes must not be constitutional because they are different. Well, being different is what made them constitutional. If there was one statute that said you had to organize one particular way, it would be an unconstitutional establishment of religion. So his initial reaction was, for us, a little strange. But more disturbing was the underlying assumption by the proponents of 1098 that because the state had provided corporate enabling statutes which gave protection for churches to hold property in corporate form, that somehow that gave them the right to use that power to reorganize the church the way they felt like it. They were absolutely dumbfounded at the reaction. They were dumbfounded. It reminds me a lot of what's going on with HHS. Couldn't believe the reaction. And of course, they were nowhere to be seen at the Capitol once the storm broke. We never saw them. In other words, they believed they had the power to treat churches as if they were simply another not-for-profit corporation or an association. This, by the way, as Kyle told you, was the argument in the Hosanna-Tabor case. There's nothing special about religions. They're just another association. Therefore, we can organize them however we want. Think about it. Suppose government could reorganize religious institutions or make religious organizations subordinate to the competing so-called rights claims of other interest groups. That is indeed what's happening with the HHS mandate. Bowing to the political pressure of abortion rights groups, the federal government, through administrative act, is redefining religious organizations so that if a church's mission and teaching includes outreach to others, if it involves activity other than simply worship, then it no longer has the protection of the First Amendment religion clause. It is a bold, naked attempt to put religion out of the public square and substitute the conscience of the government for the conscience of the church. Now, there is a sequel to Bill 1098, and this is a true story. I'm not making it up. This is very true. About 6 weeks after the rally, Bishop Laurie received a letter from the Office of State Ethics telling him that the diocese and Bishop Laurie were being investigated for violations of the state lobbying laws. And in the letter, which was a one-page letter, they did not articulate what the activities were that had caused this investigation to begin. It was very Kafkaesque. But they did allow that if we wanted to provide information to this investigation, we could give them a call. So we did. We gave them a call. And I had kind of a little bet going with our counsel because I said, this really does smack of payback, and it's probably got something to do with the rally. In the Connecticut lobbying statute says, and I'm going to really condense this, but basically, if you spend more than $2,000 to advocate to change a law or administrative action or advocate others to do so, you have to register as a lobbyist. Now, we have the Connecticut Catholic Conference, which does what you think of as lobbying activities. And as Kyle, I'm sure, can tell you, the United States Supreme Court has made it very clear that lobbying laws must be interpreted very narrowly. We still do have free speech, and political speech is always the most protected speech. So, in fact, our counsel went up and talked to the two lawyers, the Office of State Ethics, who said, well, no, it was the, the public rally. We saw those Peter Pan buses, and you must have spent more than $2,000 to send folks up. And on your website, you have opposition to Bill 899, same-sex marriage. You notice there's a little pattern here. And you probably spent more than $2,000 to put that on your website. And our counsel, in very good faith, said, look, this is what the U.S. Supreme Court has said about interpreting lobbying laws. And these are the problems that you have with this action, all of them encompassing the First Amendment: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right of association, right to petition the government for redress of grievances, just a whole litany of basic First Amendment rights. No, they weren't hearing that. They were opening this investigation. Get back to us next Friday and tell us if your client will concede that they spent more than $2,000. Well, we got back to them. We served them with a federal civil rights lawsuit. And yes, we did. And that is exactly what people in the pews did. We sent out a letter. We filed the suit we served them on Friday. They were pretty astonished. Bishop Laurie, again, assembled the priests, let everybody know. I mean, we really got the word out. Letter was read at all masses that weekend, and people clapped when we got to the point of, so we have filed a lawsuit. Because these were parishioners who were at the rally. So now the State Attorney General of course, there had been over 5,000 people at the rally who is supposed to defend state agencies, realized that he couldn't defend this action, couldn't defend investigating the church because they had a public rally because someone was trying to disestablish them. But let me say this. And so they had a cease desist, and it was over. But it points to what's going on out there. You didn't hear about this story before, or most of you didn't. There are lots of other stories like that across the country. This is what is going on. This is what the bishops have been reacting to. And I will tell you that it is a form of harassment. It takes time, energy, and resources. And what we're trying to do is run schools, help our parishioners, run our charities, and do all those wonderful, extraordinary works which the Catholic Church does. Oh, and one more thing. The Office of State Ethics, and this is an example of why they do not stop and why persistence and perseverance is required. Every year, they keep trying to raise a bill to regulate grassroots lobbying. And to be regulated means that you have to file, they come in and audit you, you have to provide your finances. It's a chilling prior restraint on speech. But there have been many, many other egregious assaults by the government on individual and institutional conscience, which can be described in a few broad strokes. The first is being spec'd out of a contract. Thus, the Catholic Migration and Relief Services, although one of the two highest scorers on the contract, their cooperative agreement was not renewed. Again, because they would not provide the full range of reproductive services and refer to abortionists. Even though they had helped victims for 5 years, and by all accounts had done so with great compassion and efficiency. Another government power used to deny religious liberty to individuals and religious organizations is the use of the licensing power. Thus, because Catholic charities will not place children with same-sex couples, their licenses to place children have been revoked in Illinois, Boston, San Francisco, and the District of Columbia. And a nurse who made it clear in the job interview and later in writing before accepting employment in a New York City hospital that she would not participate in abortions, was threatened with the loss of her job and license if she did not assist in the abortion of a 22-week fetus with Down syndrome, despite the fact there were other nurses who would do so. There's also outright discrimination by the government against religious groups. Most recently in New York City, the Bronx House of Faith and Worship and 60 other churches have been barred from renting public schools on weekends for worship, even though non-religious groups can rent the same schools for other uses. A petition to the United States Supreme Court, a petition for cert, has been denied, so the New York City ordinance stands. There is some movement in the New York State legislature to change that, but it hasn't gone anywhere as yet. Government regulation of the speech of certain faith-based activities has been attempted. In Maryland, the 40 pregnancy resource centers have been targeted 3 times in the last 4 years for regulation. There was a bill in the Maryland state legislature, fortunately it failed, where they required the centers to post that they do not provide factually accurate information. Why? Because they do not refer women for abortion. However, in Baltimore, an ordinance was passed requiring the pregnancy centers to post a sign listing the services they do not provide, abortion contraceptives, and Montgomery County passed a similar measure. Although both measures were held to be unconstitutional, again, this kind of activity by the government costs nonprofits and faith-based organizations human and financial capital. The HHS mandate is just the tip of the iceberg. Think of the things I've just told you about. It's all around the country. So the reasons prompting the formation of the Ad Hoc Committee on Religious Liberty are clear. We're facing an emerging jurisprudence in some quarters, state action in others, and educational and civic leaders, some of whom are imposing their view on the larger society, that religious liberty is secondary to the claims of different interest groups, most particularly the abortion rights activists and the pro-gay marriage proponents, who, while proclaiming tolerance and right to choose, will not tolerate the right of anyone or any institution that believes differently to live or operate their programs and services consistent with their beliefs. Bishop Laurie called for immediate action to defend religious liberty. He spoke of the first instinct and duty of pastors, which is to teach, to instruct, inspire, and animate those they serve, to cherish their God-given freedoms, to teach, to inspire that we use those God-given freedoms to work to shape a society marked by respect for the transcendent dignity and freedom of each human being. He called on the bishops to refocus, to re-energize, and awaken in ourselves, in our fellow Catholics, and the culture at large, a new appreciation for religious liberty. But more than that, he called upon us, called upon the laity, to put our gifts and expertise on the line in defense of religious liberty. Whether experts or just hardworking Catholics, people just trying to raise their children and hand on their Catholic faith. And religious liberty, not just for Catholics, but for everyone. Now, the church is remarkably equipped to do this. We have existing structures. We have our parishes, our schools, communication networks of diocesan newspapers, websites, radios, TV, Catholic organizations, the Knights and Dames of Malta, Knights and Dames of the Holy Sepulchre, the Knights of Columbus. But it requires a massive effort in catechesis, organization, persistence, and perseverance. So how will the ad hoc committee help in this effort? First, the focus of the committee is on domestic religious liberty. That does not mean, however, that the committee does not take heed of the ongoing persecution of Christians around the world. But there is a great understanding that if religious liberty is eroded in the United States, which has always been a beacon for the world, then efforts to achieve religious freedom around the world will falter. Second, the committee's efforts do involve outreach to national organizations, charities, ecumenical and interreligious partners, and scholars to form a united and forceful front in defense of religious liberty. It might interest you to know that although the media persists in calling this a Catholic fight for religious freedom, several faiths, including Guidestone Financial Resources, the Benefits Board of the Southern Baptist Convention, and the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations among them, have forcefully decried the HHS mandate as an encroachment on religious liberty. The Ad Hoc Committee is a working committee. I've had the privilege of working with the committee since its inception. The inaugural meeting was held in November 2011. There are 12 bishops on the committee, including the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, and 10 lay consultants. The lay consultants include some of the best scholars and constitutional minds in the country. They include Kevin Bain, a partner with Williams and Conley, whose practice focuses on the First Amendment, Philip Lacavara, a noted constitutional attorney who has spent a career arguing before the United States Supreme Court and is a member of the Federal Association of Malta, Mary Ann Glendon, former ambassador to the Holy See and the learned hand professor of law at Harvard Law School, Professor Rick Garnett of the University of Notre Dame Law School, who has written and spoken about the First Amendment and religious organizations, John Garvey, the former dean of Boston College Law School and now president of Catholic University of America, Martin Nussbaum, a noted constitutional attorney, who heads up his law firm's religious liberty practice in Colorado and has defended all faiths in state and federal courts, Michael McConnell, a former federal judge and now professor at Stanford University Law School, Father Raymond D'Souza, a priest who is a gifted communications specialist, and Mary Ellen Russell, who heads up the Maryland Catholic Conference, which, as I talked to you about, has spent several years defending the Catholic Church against county and state assaults. Since its inaugural meeting, the committee has met several times, and in between has worked in different groups on some very broad categories, and one of those is, of course, teaching pastoral. There's much work to be done in educating Catholics about religious liberty and inspiring them to defend it. And this catechesis that must be undertaken includes the church teaching on religious liberty and the dignity of man, as well as how we think about what constitutes a just law. Far too many Catholics, and young Catholics in particular, do not seem to know and respect the role and history of churches in advancing the dignity of the human person. So that's one of the things the committee is working on, some key messages from which this kind of catechesis can begin now and for the long term. It has to begin in our parishes and our schools. It has to begin in all our associations. I think this seminar today is fabulous. I wish it could be replicated about natural law and what's going on around the country. And this is the kind of, there's short-term, immediate catechesis that needs to be done and can be done in our parishes, in all our networks. But then there's a longer-term effort to really educate and get people to understand what's going on. Mass media. We need a short and a long-term media strategy to communicate effectively to the mass media the vital importance and the foundational principles of religious liberty. One of the things about 1098, Bill 1098 in Connecticut, was realizing how people really had to be told a lot of fundamental basics about what the government can and cannot do with religion. People got that really quickly, though, particularly when it's your parish that's going to get reorganized according to the whim of some legislator up in Hartford. But there's a lot of that to do, a lot of talking about our first liberty, religious liberty. And that's what the committee is working on, and getting key messages and working on and having a short-term media plan and a long-term. And media is not just about communicating to the media out there, but also reaching our young people where they are on the web, reaching out through blogging, through courses, reaching out through TV shows, reaching out through art, music. There's all kinds of ways to begin to educate people about religious liberty, about what the role of churches, and in particular, of course, the catechesis is about our faith and religious liberty. And of course, a big part of this is going to be communicating and making sure people know what's going on. How many of you heard about how many of you knew about the pending HHS mandate back in September? Anybody know? A few. Well, for those of us who were thinking about health benefits and how to provide them, and this has been going on for a long time. And we knew about this HHS mandate, which they kept calling the interim final rule, and there were thousands of comments filed in opposition. But no one seemed to know about that. Hosanna Tabor case. The position taken by the government was truly astonishing. And that's from the administration's own justice on the court. It was astonishing. It was never covered until finally there was a decision. But even then, it wasn't really, there wasn't enough education about it in the media that I don't know that people grasped what had been propounded by our government about our rights. Scholarly and academic concerns. There are many good scholarly works on constitutional law, and these can be effectively blended with the work of the practitioners in the field to advance the cause of religious liberty in law, culture, and the academy. And so the scholars are working with the practitioners at what needs to be done to have a greater awareness of the theological, philosophical, and anthropological underpinnings of religious liberty, particularly those based on papal documents. Public policy. The other thing, of course, the committee is looking at is legislative ways to get some broader conscience protection for individuals and religious organizations. And as many of you may or may not know, there are two bills. There's one in the Senate, the Blunt bill, and then the Fortenberry, which is the Respect of Conscience Acts. They've gotten a few more sponsors than they had before. Actually, I think they're up to 114. Is that it, Kyle? Yeah. And one of the things I would ask is that you would get on the USCCB website. It's very easy to find out. Get on the USCCB website, and they have a mechanism for you to find out about the bills and then write to your U.S. Senator and Congressman. So I hope you'll do that. But that's one of the things. And then, honestly, you have to look at ways to get by legislation enduring conscience protection from these administrative acts. This HHS mandate is an administrative act. In the sweep of a pen, they've redefined what religious organizations are. Only those worshiping, no outreach. And that's what they're doing administratively, which now, of course, is being fought. Again, time, effort, but it's important. It's why the bishops have the ad hoc committee. And then of course litigation efforts, and they're certainly looking at those options. And I'm going to totally obfuscate on that because that's the kind of thing that you look at and you plan. And we certainly have some very fine constitutional lawyers on that committee. We're blessed as Catholics with fine organizations and individuals who have volunteered their time, talent, and treasure. I hope that this seminar held today can be repeated across the country in dioceses and Catholic organizations everywhere. Because it will take all of us to defend our God-given liberty. Thank you for being a very important part of the fight. I'll take any questions. Yep.
How did the bishops feel about this whole thing? Now, do they feel like they're under attack? I mean, does it feel like the world has changed to them?
I think that, are you talking specifically about the HHS mandate or just?
The whole.
The whole. I think that the bishops feel, obviously, that religious liberty is under egregious assault in this country and has been. And that is why they established the committee. I mean, when you think about it, the reason why we're so visible, the Catholic Church, in this fight is because we're a hierarchical church and one of the largest. And we are almost, except with some of our Orthodox friends and evangelicals, the last, kind of the last men standing for the sanctity of life and traditional marriage. So yes, that's why they established the committee, because this is a priority of the bishops.
And when you say has been, how far back are you looking?
Well, it's probably within. I think it's hard to say what year everything began, because I think things are always incremental. And the way that today, when we talked about the different changes in law and culture with contraceptive use, the idea of marriage, the support for marriage and family, that kind of undermining, which over time you can see that religion has become, unfortunately, less important to some people. So there's a lot of education that needs to be done about religious liberty, about the good that religions do and provide in our society, and the wonderful history. I mean, nothing's without its history that's problematic. Nothing. No institution. But there's a lack of. It's been going on for some time now. I couldn't put the years on it, but I can tell you that in Connecticut, it was 2009, but that was almost, there had been all kinds of attacks up in smaller things, not quite as obvious. Yes?
What website or book would summarize what informed Catholics would want to know in addressing religious liberty?
I would suggest that book would be I don't know, maybe some of the more learned professors here would know a book, but I would go to the USCCB website, and there's a lot of information out there on religious liberty. So go to the USCCB website.
Can
Would
I
that get
suggest,
fun too? And you have some suggestions?
can I suggest the 5,000-year leap?
Who's that?
That has a very good, fast-reading book about natural law,
Mm-hmm.
and it ties into this subject also.
Perhaps somebody else knows. Kyle, do you know it? Kyle has one.
I think a great book about religious liberty is a book by Archbishop Chaput
Oh, that's a great one.
called,
Yes.
is it called Render Unto Caesar?
Render
or-
unto
Yeah,
Caesar.
yeah, that's a
Archbishop
wonderful book.
Chaput did a great book on that.
And it's
I read that
both
book.
scholarly and accessible.
Accessible,
Very,
it's
very
both.
good. Yeah.
You know, by the way, I did read an interesting book on this whole issue of the culture and the virtues of America, including religion. It's just out. It's one by Charles Murray. That's a fascinating book. I suggest you take a look at that if you want to kind of trace where and why things have become the way they are. There's a great deal of education that has to be done. The committee is really working on making the kind of materials and resources available for the natural networks that we have in the Catholic Church.
Are you familiar with, maybe Kyle is, any information about the chaplain of the armed forces suppressing the bishop's letter being read to the members of the armed forces?
The only information I have is what I have read, and so I don't have any good first-hand knowledge, except that my understanding was there was a paragraph that was edited out by the government, which is totally unacceptable. But again, you see these attempts by government to impose speech, or in this case, take out the speech that they didn't like about the HHS mandate. So,
Nancy,
Bob?
I was pleasantly surprised with the strength of the bishop's response last night to the press conference and the proposed compromise, particularly as it related to what they term the other stakeholders.
yes.
Is it your sense from working with the committee that they will maintain that sense of the other stakeholders in this fight, such as for-profit companies and
Yes.
not-for-profit companies
Yes.
that are not within the umbrella of the institutional church?
Yes, absolutely. And I'll tell you why. It's part of our church teaching that religious liberty is not just for religious organizations, but for the individual. So yes, absolutely. Anybody else have any questions?
I guess in hearing you give all these examples earlier, do you think we're to the point where you're going to start needing to advocate civil disobedience? Don't pay those fines. Speak out that kind of way. And I guess a question for Mr. Duncan, what happens if you don't pay the fines?
Well, I'll tell you, let me tell you a very funny story. When the Office of State Ethics was threatening the investigation, and it was not just some kind of little investigation. There's a penalty, and you can go to prison. So we got the bishop a little bear with prison stripes, and we assured him that we would visit him. I think that we are going to. I think we're going to exhaust every single possible resource, legal and otherwise. You know, Hosanna Tabor was a good case. It's not over. We don't know how wide the scope of the ministerial exception will eventually be. But it was a resounding vote that the religion clauses of the First Amendment matter. So. Well, I guess if you don't pay the fine, you go to jail. I don't know, Kyle, what?
The IRS collects.
The IRS collects them?
Yeah, I think it's just like penalties for not having health, prescribed level of health.
Right.
I think they're collected through the IRS.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, let's hope that reason and religious liberty prevails in the federal courts and in the U.S. Supreme Court.
Please join me in thanking. Thank you so much. You're wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Well, again, it was a wonderful afternoon. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I do want to thank everybody again. Just your presence here today is a great action and a great sign that you are true defenders of the faith. I want to thank Abbot Placid for his continued leadership, especially here at Belmont Abbey College, and for his initiation on this HHS mandate lawsuit that we filed. I just want to thank the diocese. Again, we've been very much supported there as well. And obviously a thank you to each of our speakers, who I think were just wonderful. And again, there's going to be Mass here at 4:45, not 5:45. And so hopefully some of you will be able to attend that as well. So again, God bless you all. Thank you so much for being here today.